Committee will come to order. We have a second panel on our discussion today about FOIA. Let me introduce the second panel, and then we'll swear you in and begin your testimony. Tom Fitton is the president of Judicial Watch, the public interest group that investigates and prosecutes government corruption. As president of Judicial Watch since 1998, with nearly 25 years' experience in public policy, Mr. Fitton has helped turn Judicial Watch into one of America's largest and most effective government watchdog organizations. Mr. Fitton is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Corruption Chronicles, and executive producer of a documentary movie, District of Corruption. In 2015, the American Conservative Union, the ACU, awarded Fitton with the Defender of the Constitution Award during its annual Conservative Political Action Conference, also known as CPAC. Cleta Mitchell is a partner and political law attorney in the Washington, D.C. office of Foley Lardner, LLP, and a member of the firm's political law practice. With more than 40 years of experience in law, politics, and public policy, Ms. Mitchell advises nonprofit and issue organizations, corporations, candidates, campaigns, and individuals on state and federal campaign finance law, election law, and compliance issues related to lobbying, ethics, and financial disclosures. She practices before the Federal Election Commission, the ethics committees of the United States House and Senate, and similar state and local enforcement bodies and agencies. She has served as legal counsel to the National Republican Senatorial Committee and the National Republican Congressional Committee. Nate Jones is the director of the Freedom Information Act project for the National Security Archives. He oversees thousands of Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, and mandatory declassification reviews, also known as MDRs, requests, and the hundreds of FOIA and MDR appeals that the archive submits each year. An active member of the American Society of Access Professionals, the professional association of the government FOIA officers. He acts as a liaison between the archive analysts and agency FOIA officers and serves as the archive's FOIA counselor to the public. He is the editor of the archive's blog Unredacted, where he writes about newly declassified documents and FOIA policy. He has authored the archive's past 5 government-wide FOIA audits, including the 2015 e-FOIA audit, most agencies falling short on mandate for online records. Ms. Garcia, Lizette Garcia, is the founder of the FOIA Resource Center. Founded in 2013, the FOIA Resource Center's mission is to put the most salient public records of the day quickly and cost-effectively in the hands of the most immediately impacted. Ms. Garcia is celebrating the first anniversary of her firm, where she works to wrest government documents from a reluctant bureaucracy using the Freedom of Information Act. Her clients are often lawmakers, trade groups, journalists, and whose ranks once included her. She moved to Washington to attend Howard University School of Law and graduated in 2008. Gabe Rotman is a legislative counsel and policy advisor in the Washington Legislative Office of the American Civil Liberties Union, often referred to as the ACLU. He advocates in Congress and the federal agencies on an array of issues in the intersection of technology and civil liberties, including privacy, cybersecurity, free expression, telecommunications, and internet policy, government transparency, as well as intellectual property. Mr. Rotman practiced law from 2007 to 2012 at Simpson, Thatcher, and Bartlett, LLP in Washington, D.C., with a focus on antitrust and foreign investment review. From 2001 to 2005, he worked in the ACLU's Washington Legislative Office as a communications staffer and senior writer. And finally, we have Ann Wiseman, who is the executive director for the Campaign for Accountability, a new nonprofit that uses research, litigation, and communication to expose misconduct and malfeasance in public life. She served for 10 years as the chief counsel for the Citizens for Responsible and Ethics in Washington. She worked for the Federal Communications Commissioner as the deputy chief of the Enforcement Bureau. She also worked for the Department of Justice as the assistant branch director, where she supervised government information litigation, including FOIA. We appreciate you all being here today. We've had a good, robust discussion with our first panel, and we welcome you to this discussion as well. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses are to be sworn before they testify. If you would please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that you will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative, and as they now take their seats, I would encourage you, in order to allow time for discussion, to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes as best you can. Your entire written statement will be entered into the record. And as members have votes coming up on the floor, there may be submissions from Congress that we would appreciate if you would follow back up on. But with that, we will start with our first witness, Mr. Fitton of Judicial Watch, and we thank you, sir, for being here, and we now recognize you for 5 minutes. Whoops, push the, got to push that
Thank you,
button.
Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to testify on behalf of Judicial Watch. Transparency is an important issue to the American people. We're a conservative group, but we're nonpartisan, and we have over 360,000 active supporters. And there are a few more widely supported groups in the country than Judicial Watch. And obviously, our focus is on the Freedom of Information Act. We're the most active requester, most active litigator, without a doubt today. And we've used the open records laws to root out corruption in the Clinton administration and to take on the Bush administration's penchant for improper secrecy. You may recall we sued the administration of President Bush all the way up to the Supreme Court over the Cheney Energy Task Force. We've been around for 21 years, but I can tell you our government is bigger than ever, and it's frankly the most secretive in recent history. President Obama promised the most transparent administration in history, but federal agencies are often black holes in terms of disclosure. We filed nearly 3,000 Freedom of Information Act requests with the Obama administration, and our staff attorneys have been forced to file around 225 lawsuits in federal court against this administration. Overwhelmingly, these lawsuits are just designed to get a yes or no answer from the administration. And administratively, agencies have built additional hurdles and stonewalled even the most basic FOIA requests. The Obama administration's casual lawbreaking, and it is lawbreaking, when it comes to FOIA, is a national disgrace and shows contempt for the American people's right to know what their government is doing. You know, Thomas Jefferson, the Founding Fathers, all thought transparency was important. Jefferson said, if we are to guard against ignorance and remain free, it is the responsibility of every American to be informed. And FOIA increasingly is not working in that regard. Transparency is about self-government. If we don't know what the government is doing, how is that self-government? Frankly, how is it even a republic? Now, we have this transparency crisis here in Washington, D.C. The government's doing more than ever, but is even less transparent. Never in our history has so much money been spent with so little accountability. Frankly, all of Congress should focus on government reform and oversight instead of assigning it to just one or two committees. Americans are rightly worried that they're losing their country. We have the forms of democracy, elections, campaigns, votes, political fundraising, ads. But when Congress authorizes $1.5 trillion in spending after just 3 days of debate, and when the executive branch won't tell you much unless you're willing to make a federal court case out of an issue, frankly, that isn't democracy, and it certainly isn't self-government. But FOIA shows that there is a way forward out of this transparency crisis, and it's a corruption crisis as well. We've shown that one citizen group using the FOIA and independent oversight can help the American people bring their government back down to earth and under control. And Judicial Watch obviously has succeeded in uncovering documents that have been denied to Congress. On Benghazi, it's been a little over a year since Judicial Watch uncovered a declassified email showing that then White House Deputy Strategic Communications Advisor Ben Rhodes and other Obama administration's officials, not intelligence officials, put out the talking points used by Susan Rice, that the big lie that the Benghazi attack was rooted in an internet video and not a failure of policy. Now there's a select committee because of those disclosures. A select committee, to put it charitably, doesn't seem to be getting much of anywhere. And Judicial Watch's litigation continues to be the go-to place for information about what's going on in the Benghazi scandal. The IRS scandal. Judicial Watch litigation forced the agency to admit that Lois Lerner's emails were supposedly lost. And it was Judicial Watch's litigation that forced the IRS to admit that her emails were not actually lost. And only Judicial Watch uncovered the troubling revelation that the Obama IRS and Justice Department were collaborating on prosecuting the same groups that the IRS had lawlessly suppressed. We're still getting screwed around by the IRS. We just filed today a filing that the IRS, updating the court on the IRS's machinations with Lois Lerner's lost emails. They told us there were no tapes. It turns out there were tapes. They made us go through all sorts of hoops to figure out where the lost emails might be. They made the court go through all sorts of hoops. And then it turns out that the Treasury Inspector General had this information and had these tapes. They had turned over those tapes one day after they had been requested, the IRS to TITCA. They didn't tell us that, and they made us go through this fight with them over where these lost emails would be. They knew where they were. And then once TITCA found the emails that were lost, IRS said, well, they're not subject to FOIA. They're TITCA's records, not the IRS's records. Then a few weeks ago, they said, oh, we got some emails from TITCA, so now there are records, and we'll get to them when we get to them. Really outrageous conduct. And then, of course, we have the most egregious violation of federal transparency law since FOIA was passed 50 years ago. And that is Mrs. Clinton's use of a secret email account to avoid disclosure under the Federal Records Act and avoid disclosure under FOIA. And when you have the State Department agency tell Judicial Watch they looked for records and they couldn't find anything, and groups like Judicial Watch end their lawsuits based on no records being found, that was a lie. They didn't look for the records. Mrs. Clinton was head of the agency, and she had a legal responsibility to maintain those records. And there is criminal liability already for failure to maintain those records. It's called concealment. You can't conceal records. You can't take them away if they're federal records. And that was what Mrs. Clinton did. And there is a long-standing law that prohibits that. And certainly in the least, that should be subject to criminal investigation independently. And I'll just finally close. Obviously, Congress is not subject to FOIA. It ought to be. The courts aren't subject to FOIA. It ought to be. But the problem is the executive branch is avoiding FOIA. FOIA reform is important, and we support serious, impactful legislation, and we encourage you to keep on working on that, and we'll work with you as appropriate. Thank you for your time.
Thank the gentleman. Ms. Mitchell, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for having a hearing on this really important topic. I have, in my testimony, explained my experiences with FOIA with a number of my clients over the past several years, nonprofit, grassroots citizens groups. I want to focus today on just one of those experiences, and that is with the IRS and Treasury on behalf of the Tea Party Patriots. When the IRS and Treasury issued its 501c4 regulations, which would restrict and allow the IRS to govern free speech and political activities of 501c4 organizations, regulations that were developed in secret, that were not included on the plan for rulemaking that all federal agencies are supposed to publish regularly, and were released the day after Thanksgiving on Black Friday, November of 2013, we wanted information about where did these regulations come from? What were they about? How were they developed? So on behalf of Tea Party Patriots, in early December 2013, we filed FOIA requests with the IRS and Treasury seeking information and the documents related to the development of the regulations. The Department of Treasury wrote back and said, we're going to invoke our 15-day automatic extension. And that was all we ever heard from the Treasury Department until we sued them. The IRS wrote back and said, we're invoking our 15-day extension, but we're not going to be able to answer within the statutory period. We'll answer your FOIA request April the 7th of 2014. April the 7th, I get a letter saying, we're not going to be able to answer your FOIA requests as we promised. You'll need to give us until July the 2nd. So I called the woman who sent the letter and said, tell me what the progress is. How are we doing? At which point she said, well, you know, I process the requests and I send them to the appropriate people within the agency, and then I don't ever hear anything back. I said, you've never heard anything back? She said, no. I said, well, how did you come up with these dates? She said, well, I was estimating. I said, so you made them up? She said, basically. So 1 week later, we filed a lawsuit in federal court here in D.C., a FOIA appeal. And we reached an agreement with the Department of Justice where they would provide monthly rolling productions from the IRS and Treasury. And I have brought the binders with me, if you would like to see them. And this is the most recent, these are the most recent production, which I got yesterday, day before yesterday. It is you can't see it, page after page of documents that are either totally or partially redacted. All this, ladies and gentlemen, this is the deliberative process privilege in action. We have not received one substantive document. In all of these binders, we have received, we did agree with the Justice Department that they would produce a Vaughan index, which is like a privilege log. So we do have a list of thousands of pages of documents they haven't produced at all, and the pages they have produced are either totally blacked out or partially blacked out such that all significant information is removed. So what we have really effectively learned is that the deliberative process privilege has completely subverted and destroyed the purpose of FOIA. And the Tea Party patriots have spent tens of thousands of dollars just to try to understand regulations which were withdrawn. So I have a question as to why the deliberative process privilege would still apply to regulations that have been withdrawn. But we now know they're still working on redoing them, but we're asking about the last set. But the point is this. My client has spent tens of thousands of dollars. We spent many, many hours trying to get information to which we are entitled. And all we've gotten are these binders full of redacted documents. And so I have this to say, which is that FOIA is completely broken. What has happened is that the courts and the agencies have rendered it essentially meaningless. And so I have three recommendations. Number one, this legislation that is pending in the House and the companion bill in the Senate needs to have one provision added. Congress should eliminate the deliberative process privilege. It is the deliberations of the agencies and the process by which the decisions are made that the people have a right to know about. That's the basic information that we seek. And so Congress should eliminate, by statute, just X out the deliberative process privilege. And number two, I also recommend that there have to be penalties that are imposed for individual government employees and agency heads who fail to comply with FOIA. And number three, Congress should take all of the money. I've heard the conversation about, well, you know, we cut their budgets and all. Let me tell you, this took a lot of extra work. It would have been a lot less expensive for these for the IRS and Treasury to just copy the documents and send them to us. But going through and redacting takes a lot of extra processing time. But I would say this, Congress should go through every federal agency and take the money that is now spent, the tens of millions of dollars now being spent for the public affairs offices who put out press releases, who tell us propaganda, whether it's true or not, that they want us to know, and reallocate all of those funds to FOIA processing. And then I think Congress should keep a scorecard and should know how agencies are doing in terms of responding to FOIA and should take that into account at appropriations time. So I would say this, only Congress can fix FOIA. Nobody else can fix it. Congress needs to revive FOIA, to breathe life back into the system, and to make it the Transparency Act that it was intended to be almost 50 years ago. Thank you for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you. Mr. Jones, you now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the committee, thank you very much for this opportunity. At the National Security Archive, we've filed more than 50,000 FOIA requests, conducted 14 government-wide FOIA audits that have displayed the inner workings or non-workings of over 250 FOIA shops. Our White House email lawsuits against every president from Reagan to Obama have saved hundreds of millions of messages and set a standard for digital preservation that the rest of government has not yet achieved. The key point I'd like to convey to you today is that the tremendous promise of the Freedom of Information Act, a tool that citizens can use to efficiently and effectively gain access to records produced by the government, has not been fulfilled. Unlike some in the previous panels or others, I wouldn't say it's broken. One only look to the National Security Archive's website and see the millions of pages of documents we've got declassified that have rewritten history and helped write policy, or look at Jason Leopold's scoops. But the Act has certainly not fulfilled its promise. So today I'd like to present three of the largest barriers to FOIA requesters and how I believe the committee's legislation that, thank you for already passing, will already help these barriers. But before I begin on barriers, I have to note that there actually are dozens of exemplary FOIA agencies and hundreds of star FOIA professionals who really do have transparency in their bones and placed requirements of the FOIA above bureaucratic concerns and fear of government and fear of embarrassment, excuse me. To these agencies and FOIA specialists, thank you. I guess, in this case, the reward for competence is inconspicuousness. But back to barriers. The first negative interaction a FOIA requester experiences with an agency is over fees, because many agencies have adopted a strategy of using the specter of high FOIA fees to deter people from making legitimate requests. This practice is fiscally unnecessary. FOIA fees cover just less than 1% of the cost of implementing FOIA, and it's also often illegal. The 2007 FOIA amendments make it very clear that anytime an agency misses its FOIA deadline, it can't charge most FOIA fees. But many agencies, with the very troubling support of the Department of Justice, have improperly skirted the crystal clear intent of these provisions so they can use sticker shock to head off requests without processing them. Fortunately, both FOIA bills include language which should prohibit these hijinks once and for all. The second barrier, improper withholding of information. This Sunshine Week, White House spokesperson Josh Earnest repeated a Department of Justice talking point touting a 91% FOIA release rate. But this figure is extremely misleading. DOJ numbers ignore 9 of the 11 reasons FOIA requests are denied. The actual FOIA release rate is just over 50%, and many of those partial releases, you see them right here. Reams and reams of wholly blacked out pages are classified as partial and go into the DOJ's figure as such. More startling, the AP's recent finding that when challenged, government agencies admit they wrongly withhold information almost a third of the time. As this committee well knows, the most oft-abused exemption is Exemption 5, the go-to exemption that agencies use to withhold embarrassing, incriminating, or even burdensome to process documents. Happy to talk more about that later. But I do laud both of the B5 fixes in the bill. They're very good. The third barrier is the inability for agencies to leverage technology to improve FOIA and record-keeping procedures. Because of this, your bill's language instructing agencies to make information public to the greatest extent possible through modern technology is very welcome. FOIA shops are far behind the private sector utilizing e-discovery and automated front-end redaction tools to process requests, and they're also far behind making their releases digitally available to the world. Just 40% of agencies follow the intent of the 1996 e-FOIA amendments by routinely posting documents online as they're released. Now, the good news is there are some good examples. The FOIA online agencies post documents as a matter of practice, and the Department of State, for all of its other FOIA and record-keeping problems, does have the best online FOIA reading room that posts all of its releases online. Email. Today, right now, federal agencies are still not required to digitally preserve their emails. The deadline is not until December 2016. Until then, federal employees will continue to be allowed to select themselves which emails they believe to be federal records, print them out, and file them in a box. As long as this practice is allowed to continue, it is unrealistic to expect that any federal agency will properly search emails in response to FOIAs, or that their email preservation rate will be any better than the State Department's 0.006% department-wide. The final overarching point I'd like to make is that the root cause of these problems that you've heard today is a lack of an independent, robust organization that monitors and enforces FOIA compliance throughout the federal government, a FOIA beat cop. The current process of encouraging agency compliance, that's what the DOJ does at the same time, it defends agency withholdings and abuses, and reviewing agency compliance, that's what OJIS does after it gets OMB approval to review, are clearly not establishing agency compliance with the FOIA. My fear is that without robust enforcement, your excellent bill won't fix the root cause of the problem. Thank you very much for this hearing. Thank you for passing the excellent bill out of committee.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Ms. Garcia, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for having me. Actually, we're coming up on our second anniversary, and you're welcome to join us at our rooftop party. In the meantime, my written remarks and planned remarks have already been submitted for the record, so I thought I might take the time allotted to me to address some of the issues already raised by the committee, if that's possible. Mr. Chairman, you did an excellent job of laying out the land of FOIA. There are a lot of, an article went out last night that's going viral right now, and inviting 25-year-olds to come and watch how their government works. They're learning for the first time that they're entitled to public records under the law. It's like crazy. So I definitely appreciate you laying out this sort of parameters of the law. One thing I would clarify is that of the 9 exemptions that are listed in the FOIA statute, only 6 of them are discretionary, 3 of them are exclusions. 3 are, according to the law, you're not allowed to have these records, but 6 of them are discretionary, which means that agencies are not compelled to conceal those records. They actually have some judgment and can say, you know what, maybe we'd like to keep these back, but honestly, it wouldn't hurt. Let's give them out. Right now, the agencies are treating them as de facto exclusions, so all 9 exemptions are now being withheld. To Mr. Cummings' point, the ranking member, I'm afraid I would dispute the records, the numbers that are self-reported by the agencies. The full-time employee rate, although it's gone down, it's been far surpassed by a spike in contractor workers replacing government employees. While they shouldn't, according to the Federal Acquisition Regulation, be performing inherently governmental functions, in many cases they are. I've actually requested the records, and even something as small as CBP is paying $250,000 per staffer outside of the government employment environment. So another thing that's actually causing a spike in spending in request, Mr. Cummings raised the issue of requests spiking under the Obama administration. It's actually, I think Amnesty is responsible for the spike in requests. There is a league of immigration advocates who have encouraged all individuals who would like to be approved for amnesty to file a FOIA request seeking their record, their file, their immigration file, and this is actually singularly responsible for that spike in requests. To go on to whether agencies are punishing FOIA officers, I actually think it's the reverse, sir. It's actually the case that the FOIA chief that was in charge at the IRS over the time of Lois Lerner delaying release and not knowing where the records were, in fact, that person has been promoted and is now in charge of withholding Obamacare records over at CMS. And so they're actually rewarded for keeping the government secrets rather than punished for not leaving them out. Those are pretty much the issues that I wanted to raise. In my written remarks, I raised the issue of fees also, just like Mr. Jones. The idea that the regular American citizen cannot file a FOIA request, that you have to be somebody as big as the AP or Bloomberg, it's just unacceptable. OGIS right now it's where records requests actually go to die. So in a sense, I'm like the citizens OGIS. I don't have a big dramatic story to tell you that I don't get the records, because I actually do get the records without going to court. And one example is one I got for Pro English, where they were able to get the records of Obamacare being promoted in languages other than English. But getting back to OGIS, they've actually been tasked, their enabling authorization legislation tasks them with providing agencies with procedural guidelines so that they can actually improve their FOIA requests. 4 years later, the Government Accountability Office did a report and found that, in fact, OGIS wasn't doing that at all. And so if it hasn't done what it was initially established for, I'm not sure why we should trust it for more responsibilities. And lastly, with regard to the continued treatment of DOJ as the FOIA cop, I think I heard earlier today. In fact, as was pointed out by Mr. Silver, DOJ is actually the litigator that fights to the death all these FOIA requests. And so I think it's quite a conflict of interest for them to position themselves as the leader in the FOIA world. And in point of fact, the courts have told them they are not. There is no single agency responsible for administration of the FOIA under the law, according to Administrative Procedure Act. And so DOJ has positioned itself that way by hosting trainings where they teach FOIA officers across the federal agencies how to avoid fulfillment of FOIA requests. So it's DOJ that's positioned themselves that way. We continue to give them that credit because they bamboozle media, unfortunately, into believing that they are the FOIA chiefs. And it just sort of becomes a circular process. So those are my remarks. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Mr. Rotman, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting the American Civil Liberties Union to testify today on the Freedom of Information Act. The ACLU believes that the right to know what the government is doing in our name is a necessary corollary and prerequisite to the exercise of our First Amendment rights to freedom of speech, press, assembly, and petition. We simply cannot enjoy these rights to the fullest extent of the framers' intent without an informed populace. The Freedom of Information Act should be, but often is not, the most important tool in guaranteeing this right to know, and we applaud the committee for holding this crucial hearing. As detailed in our written testimony, we offer a number of reforms that could easily and quickly be adopted and that would improve the process for users and government agencies alike. For instance, Congress could, mandate the creation of a government-wide portal that would provide users with a one-stop shop for the submission of FOIA requests to any agency or agencies, that would track all requests, and that would allow requesters to easily check the status of their requests. Congress could require the posting of all released documents online in an easily text-searchable format and require agencies to store electronic documents, including emails, also in an easily searched format. Congress should clarify that agencies may not falsely issue no records responses when, in fact, records exist but contain sensitive law enforcement material, or the existence of those records is classified, and the records are therefore subject to the exclusions of Section 552C. In such cases, agencies should not lie, but should simply offer what amounts to a GLOMAR response. That is, they should say, quote, "We interpret all or part of your response as a request for records that, if they exist, would not be subject to the disclosure requirements of FOIA pursuant to Section 552C, and we will therefore not process that portion of your request." Importantly, Congress should resist the creation of new exemptions to FOIA, such as that proposed in the Senate's Cybersecurity Information Sharing Bill, which is currently pending in that chamber. As others have noted, Congress should pass the FOIA reform legislation, which is currently pending in both chambers, which would create the portal I mentioned above and would codify the presumption of disclosure absent foreseeable harm, which is currently applicable in the agencies through executive directive. Congress should also reintroduce from earlier versions of the bill a balancing test for Exemption 5, which would allow agencies and the courts to order the disclosure of records covered by Exemption 5 privileges or the work product doctrine if in the public interest. And relatedly, Congress must address the growing problem of secret law, which is anathema in a participatory democracy and is epitomized in secret court opinions permitting, for instance, the wholesale collection of telephone metadata under foreign intelligence surveillance laws, and the Office of Legal Counsel opinions authorizing torture and targeted killing. The Freedom of Information Act and our open and transparent system of democratic government is the ultimate safeguard of our essential freedoms. This notion was at the very heart of Congressman John Moss's decade-long fight to pass FOIA almost 50 years ago in 1966. Indeed, on the floor of the House during debate over the measure, he made that clear. Information about government, he said, is as basic to the intellectual diet as our proper seasonings to the physical diet. Our Constitution recognized this need by guaranteeing free speech and a free press. Mr. Speaker, those wise men who wrote that document, which was then and is now a most radical document, could not have intended to give us an empty right. Inherent in the right of free speech and of our free press is the right to know. It is our solemn responsibility as inheritors of that cause to do all in our power to strengthen those rights and to give them meaning. Our actions today in this House will do precisely that. And it is in that spirit that I thank the committee for holding this essential hearing on how to further strengthen those rights through an improved Freedom of Information Act. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Wiseman, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I have spent many, many years fighting for greater public access to records that show the public what our government is doing and why. And despite its flaws, I continue to believe the FOIA offers the best tool we have for this purpose. Like Mr. Jones, I do not agree with some on the earlier panel that suggested the FOIA is broken. That said, however, the statute as currently written definitely presents loopholes and limitations that opportunistic agencies have used to circumvent its underlying disclosure purpose. There are steps this committee and Congress as a whole can take to make the FOIA better, and I think they start most significantly with passing the FOIA Oversight and Implementation Act of 2015, which enjoys rare bipartisan support, and now, Mr. Chairman, boasts another important champion in you. The current situation cries out for the kind of meaningful and robust reforms in this legislation. We've heard a lot today about Exemption 5, and I echo those sentiments, that Exemption 5 is, I believe, the most abused exemption that is used to block public access to a wealth of information. In litigation that I brought when I was at Crew against the Department of Justice, DOJ went so far as to argue it had no legal obligation to produce a single OLC opinion, even those that provide the definitive position of the executive branch or a definitive statutory interpretation that all agencies must follow. Exemption 5 has become the catch-all to withhold virtually any records agencies fear may result in embarrassment or unwanted attention. And the FOIA Act addresses this problem by excluding records from Exemption 5 that embody the working law, effective policy, or final decision of the agency. I think this will avoid the very harm that Congress thought it was legislating against, the accretion or development of a body of secret law, something that has been widely criticized across the political spectrum. I also agree with Mr. Ottman, too, though, that the bill should go further. It should include a provision that was introduced last year that would add a balancing test, and here's why. Well, I would certainly support efforts to get rid of the deliberative process privilege altogether. I don't think that's a very realistic outcome. But in the discovery context, if you are a litigant and you want information that the government is claiming is deliberative process, you get to argue to a court that your need for that information outweighs the need of the government to keep it secret. And I believe by importing that test into the FOIA, it would provide the public and representatives of the public, such as those on this panel and the previous panel, to at least be able to make the argument that the public need for the information outweighs the government's reflexive invocation of the deliberative process privilege. So I would urge the committee to go back and consider adding in that provision. I also agree that by codifying the presumption of openness will go a long way. Right now, we have what I would call is just an aspirational goal, and agencies are free ultimately to do what they want. I think if we want to have the kind of transparency that President Obama committed to, we need that codification. At bottom, I think agencies need to understand that FOIA matters, not just as a statutory command, because it serves a critical role in preserving and advancing our democratic ideals. I have been privileged to meet with many visiting dignitaries and government officials from emerging democracies, and I am struck again and again by how they express the belief that by passing a similar law in their countries, that is the only way that they will have a guaranteed right to have a democratic form of government. Sadly, in our country, however, too many agencies have lost sight of the importance of this right in our own governance. Instead, they view their responsibilities under the FOIA as a burden and a distraction from their primary missions. I think this Congress, through legislation like the FOIA Act, needs to send a very clear and unmistakable message that FOIA still matters and FOIA remains at the core of every agency's central mission. I would be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank you all for your comments, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. There are two issues that I want to deal with, even though we have passed the bill out of committee, that I think we need to address before we encourage and bring it up to the floor. One of those is limiting back the exceptions. What I would like you to do is as something that you would appreciate if you would really put some thought and brain power behind, is to get back to this committee in about a week's time. You've been looking at FOIA, you've spent time with FOIA, you've spent years looking at it. How would we reconstitute those 9? Should they be 3? Should there be 2? Should it be, maybe it's 18 and they just have to be much more specific? How would you take that section of FOIA and redo it in such a way that there are certain things, there are certain privacy things with individuals that have to be, I think we'd all agree about that, but I do hear this resounding drum beat that says it's being far too used. It's so liberal in its approach that you can put everything under there, and then you get what Ms. Mitchell here is binders full of redactions that, and we deal with this the same thing in Congress. I mean, even when we issue subpoenas, we get information that's so heavily redacted, it's ridiculous. So we would appreciate your thoughts and comments in writing back on that as we, at the staff level, in a bipartisan way, try to redo that. The other one that I'm struggling with a little bit, that I need your help and insight, and I appreciate some verbal comments, but again, give it a little bit of thought, is what is the consequence? Because if there are no consequences, now part of that can be who pays, but ultimately it's the taxpayers that end up paying, right? No skin off somebody's back if you got to pay. So, but there has got to be some degree of consequence for noncompliance. And for just running out the 20-day clock, they just blow right through that. And we're talking about years often for these materials. So, Ms. Garcia, I'm going to start with you because I can tell you're anxious to talk about that, and then Mr. Fitton, too, if you could jump in here.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Actually, because I don't take these requests to court, I'm probably the most experienced in terms of securing compliance without that stick. The statute actually does provide for consequences to a FOIA officer. That's why every single decision has to be signed by an individual. It's often the case that, for instance, State Department is getting away with little initials so that you can't track down who the person was who made that decision. And then once it goes to court, which I never go to court and they know I don't go to court, but if you went to court, you couldn't really pin that back on one person. The statute does provide. Problem is, it gets triggered by the judge. The judge has to find that there was arbitrary or capricious or like just so outlandish. Guess how many times they've ever referred something to special counsel? 0. Big goose egg. In addition to that, because FOIA cases are decided at the litigation level, I know a lot about litigation only because that's the way I'm able to avoid it. But the fact is that it's a closed set, the FOIA request. So when it comes to a court, it's not like an unbounded discovery situation, typically. You could go there, but typically it's just the closed record that was before the agency at the time they made their decision and their appeal.
Okay. Let me
Sorry,
let me go to Mr. Rotman and then Ms. Mitchell and Mr. Fitton. And we have to keep going here. So yes, Mr. Rotman.
So I think that so fundamentally one of the primary issues that's happening with FOIA today is this question of secret law, and it goes to and it covers a lot of ground. Part of it is this deliberative process privilege, which is being used to keep what agencies are calling pre-decisional documents from the public, but those documents, for instance, will show internal dissent on questions that are of the utmost importance for public policy, and they'll actually contain documents that are binding on agencies. One of the other.
So let me just, because my time's expiring and we're going to have votes and we're going to get cut short. Ms. Mitchell here, consequence. How do you institute consequence for noncompliance?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think that we should look at some of the states. The state of Florida has imposed criminal consequences for failure to abide by the state equivalent in Florida of their Freedom of Information Act. And there have been people prosecuted, and it has actually had the deterrent effect of making agency people realize that if there are consequences, they better follow the law.
Okay. Mr. Fitton?
Well, it's difficult to impose consequences on decisions that are discretionary, and that if a court disagrees, two people disagree. But if you eliminate the discretion, it's easier. But where you have this willful withholding of documents, there already is a law that could put you in jail for 3 years for unlawfully and willfully concealing records. And there's no limit as to how that could be applied. And of course, a change in procedure and a change in attitude and approach by the agency heads, by the political appointees that reward disclosure and punish the arbitrary or broad exemptions that are used where everything is withheld because it's deliberative process as opposed to a more careful analysis.
Thank you. I would like all of you to give you a chance to respond, but I'm a minute past my time here, so we got other members who'd like to ask questions. So now recognize Mr. Cummings for 5 minutes.
I want to be effective and efficient. I mean, we can go on this merry-go-round forever. And there are clearly problems. And we've got a FOIA bill. And I know this may have been answered before, but I was tied up in the Benghazi hearing, meeting. So I'm going to ask you what has probably already been asked. How can we're going to sit down and try to improve the bill that we have so that we can accomplish something. And in other words, to do what the law was intended to do, and that is the FOIA law. Give me the elements of what needs to be in that legislation. You all are the folks who are the experts. And you know, I keep hearing about the criminal consequences. You know, I got to tell you, I live in a neighborhood where people go to prison for stealing a bike. And then we got people on Wall Street that, in some instances, have been responsible for, and banks, for causing millions of people to lose money. So, people in my block say, well, what's that about? I'm not saying that criminal consequences are not appropriate in certain instances. I just wonder, when you have that, do you really get to the people who are truly responsible for what Mr. McGraw called a little earlier the culture? And so I just want to know, from a very practical, sometimes I think we in trying to resolve problems, we go all the way around the mulberry bush, and we need to just go straight ahead and say, okay, dip, 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 and this is what we're going to do so that we can have transparency, accountability, effectiveness, and efficiency. What would we have to have in the legislation to accomplish those things?
I would agree with you, Mr. Cummings. Overcriminalization is not really the answer. I mean, at some point, like if you completely destroy a computer, like a server getting wiped, then you reach spoliation to the level of criminal acts. But below that, I think that there's a much lower threshold. And one of the ideas I would have is to cap the funding to the agencies. We talked a lot about raising funds. In fact, they should be reduced. There's a lot of slush fund money that's going into FOIA. 25% of the budgets are being directed to defending against FOIAs, and that doesn't even include contractors. So the same way a prosecutor, you were saying about the criminal, a kid who steals a bike, the same way we cap U.S. attorneys' offices, the amount of money, and they have to exercise prosecutorial discretion. Who are they going to charge? Who are they not? We should do that with FOIA. Right now, it's a limitless fund. DOJ will fight to the death every single little ounce.
Mr. Cummings, thank you very much. I think, speaking practically, as you said, we have two very good FOIA bills that have passed the Senate and passed the House last session without becoming law. So I don't think we should throw the baby out the bathwater.
I didn't say throw the baby out.
Okay.
No.
Well,
I think you didn't hear me. I said it 2 or 3 times. I said, what do we do to improve it or make it even better? I said that one of the things that the chairman has said to me, that we would sit down and try to take a look at 653 and try to make it even stronger or make it more practical or whatever. But I just wanted to know from you all what.
The answer.
I want to start with that.
What to improve is to continue to make the Office of Government Information Services strong enough so that agencies fear it, and that it can compel agencies to release more information to more people more quickly.
Mr. Cummings, I have 3 suggestions that I would make. One we've already discussed, but you were not here, and that is I would revisit the idea of adding a balancing test for Exemption 5, deliberative process material, because I think that is really the only way to level the playing field and avoid the kind of abuses we're seeing. 2, I would look for more oversight within the executive branch, and I would consider using inspectors general. They have done some of this work. I think that their obligations under the FOIA should be made explicit, and I think this committee should consider legislation that would require them to report maybe every 2 years back to Congress on how their agencies are doing with implementing the FOIA, because I don't think either the Department of Justice, which I don't think is a fair dealer in this fight, nor the Office of Government Information Services, which is really overworked, even, it can barely meet the obligations it currently has, is best situated. And I have a very modest, but I think practical suggestion, which is to require explicitly that every requester be given the name, contact information of someone at the agency who knows something about their request that they can contact and talk to. Thank you.
Ms. Mitchell, and then with the chairman's indulgence.
Well, Mr. Cummings, I actually think that after looking at the jurisprudence, the case law on the deliberative process privilege, it is unintelligible. It is mind-numbing to read those cases. And I think that Congress needs to eliminate the deliberative process privilege altogether. There are two other sections, two other types of privileges under the Exemption 5, the attorney work product in anticipation of litigation, and the attorney-client privilege where the counsel to an agency is giving legal advice to the agency personnel making decisions. And I really think that that is as broad as it should be. I do not believe that Congress should give federal judges who have completely mucked up, including the Supreme Court, the whole deliberative process privilege. I think it has to be very clear, and you should not give them the authority to decide the balancing. The presumption is openness, the presumption is deliver the documents, and if you read some of these cases where the judges have decided, well, is it pre-decisional, is it deliberative? I mean, what does that mean, for Pete's sake? I mean, normal people can't understand all that. I don't understand all of that. It used to be, in the common law definition, the agency head had to sign off before it could be invoked, the deliberative process privilege could be invoked. My favorite of the deliberative process privilege invoked in the production that I brought here today is the withholding of documents written by a summer intern as deliberative process, who had gathered research and wrote memos, and that's all been redacted and withheld, and either redacted or withheld, but they don't deliver, they won't tell us the name because they say this person was not a decision maker. So these are the kinds of things that the agencies are just unilaterally deciding, and I think the only way to deal with it is to just get rid of that deliberative process privilege altogether.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Jordan from Ohio for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. Mr. Fenton, let me go back to where I was with the first panel. We had a group of journalists who had never testified here before, but felt it was important to come talk about this issue in front of Congress. And I just want to make sure we're all clear, and I'll run the same questions by you. In your judgment, has the process of trying to get information from federal agencies, has it gotten worse and more difficult to get that information?
Yes.
Deliberative process exemption has increased dramatically.
Yes.
And the number of redactions that when you do get the stuff, after it taking forever, you got a whole bunch more redactions on the material.
Yes.
And other exemptions that you may see as well.
Yes.
Okay. So much so that the first panel, I mean, I still think this is amazing, that none of them had ever testified on this issue before, but yet the press has to come testify about restrictions the press is receiving, even though we have this thing called the First Amendment. Pretty amazing. And I think it's also important to remember the entire context. Not only are agencies unwilling to give citizens information, but the very same agencies that may not give information under a legitimate FOIA request were also targeting citizens for exercising their First Amendment rights, right?
Right.
Ms. Mitchell, I know you can talk about that, right? I mean, so take the IRS, for example. They may not comply with certain FOIA requests that you want, but they were also not just not complying with giving citizens right information they had a right to get, they were also targeting potentially those same citizens.
Just to ask, we represented, worked with Wayne Allen Root, who was a vice presidential candidate for the Libertarian Party. But he had been audited under suspicious circumstances. It took us a year to get this man's one IRS file. And we didn't go to court over it, but to just get your own file shouldn't take a year from an agency such as the IRS.
You're exact. All I'm trying to do is sometimes we get focused. Okay, the agencies are dragging their feet. They're doing more redactions, more exemptions. We got to remember the big picture. These same agencies have targeted citizens.
Right.
So these same agencies have behaved so poorly that the press, for the first time ever, has to come testify about restrictions the press is getting. I mean, it's unprecedented where we're at. So I would just, to the chairman, say we've got to understand the entire context here of what's going on.
It's catch me if you can government. And the agencies don't like to turn over documents, and unless you're represented in court, it is unlikely you're going to get a substantive response from the government.
Well, we've seen.
Unless you're willing to wait years and months, which is outside what the law requires.
No, that's all, I mean, what Judicial Watch has proven that the only way you're going to get stuff is almost the only way, is to go to court. We get that. I want to say, or ask all of you, have you seen a marked increase in all the things we're talking about since this administration took office? Mr. Fenton.
Yes, we've had a dramatic increase in government spending and activity and less transparency.
Ms. Mitchell.
Well, Mr. Jordan, actually, I hadn't been involved in FOIA until I started dealing with clients who'd been targeted. And so we began to try to get information from federal agencies, not the IRS, but others, and submitted FOIA requests to find out, to try to get to the bottom of the targeting. And I include some documentation in my testimony about some of my clients and our efforts to try to get information.
Yeah. Ms. Mitchell, let me ask you a question. I just thought of this. I wasn't in my plan questions. You had clients who were targeted, and then you did FOIA requests to get information.
Correct.
Did it ever work in reverse? Do you have any clients who requested information, and because they requested information, were then in some way harassed by a federal agency?
Well, they'd already been harassed.
I understand in the situation. I'm just curious. Maybe we don't know, but this is something I'm kind of interested in finding out if it's ever worked the other way around. Someone's asking for information, and because of that request, they suddenly become a target of harassment from an agency. I mean,
Well, the IRS told us when they audited us during the Clinton years, what do you expect when you sue the president? You're going to scrutinize the government's going to scrutinize you.
I got 30 seconds left, so I want to go to the memo. I mean, I read this memo that White House counsel sent to all the general counsels of the various federal agencies. If this, as I said to the first panel, this isn't a chilling impact on what we're talking about, I don't know what is. When every agency should consult with the White House counsel's office on all documents that may involve documents with White House equities. What is any interest the White House may have? That's as broad as you can get. And then they further go down here. They list every GAO request, judicial subpoenas, FOIA request. They list everything you can imagine. I've never seen anything like that. Go ahead.
Mr. Jordan, more dramatic than that, weeks after the president issued that directive saying that agencies should err on the side of transparency and openness, he was awarded an award by the transparency community, not including me, on the promise of his future transparency, sort of like the Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
And in point of fact, he closed it to the press. So the actual receipt of the award was not open to the media. If that doesn't send a chilling statement, I don't know what does.
I thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Wells from Massachusetts for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your help. I just want to point out one contrast here. Up until about an hour ago, when the USA Freedom Act passed, the government, in getting information about the general public, was unfettered. Warrantless gathering of information of the public. And even when they had to go to the FISA court, we could find no examples of the FISA court ever denying a warrant for the government to gather metadata regarding its citizens. So here you have the government with absolute discretion on gathering information about private citizens, and yet when private citizens try to understand a little bit about what the government is doing, you know, it's a roadblock, complete roadblock. I would like to talk about something that a couple of the panelists have brought up about the Inspector General, the way we have Inspector Generals in each department. And they do a pretty good job. I have to say, I'm pretty pleased with the way they do their job, but they are also sometimes denied access to information or given the runaround like you all are on a regular basis. So the problem is this weighing, this balancing, and determining whether some information lies within one of the exemptions or should be protected. And you all have to go to court to have that figured out, and it's a very long process for most of you. Would it be helpful if we had, you know, an advocate general for freedom of information within the IG's office, where they could, in the first instance, determine whether or not these people are stonewalling and looking at the information and saying, hey, wait a minute, this does not pass muster. This is not part of the deliberative process. This is because a lot, from the previous panel, they were saying how stuff that was just, there was no contest that this should have been information that was, and even the judges, when it finally went to court, the judges said this should have never been denied. It should have been, it should have been responded to. The public should have had this information. There's got to be some way to short-circuit this and to incentivize these agencies to cooperate as FOIA would intend. And, that could be civil penalties. It could be, awarding costs or damages to a party that hasn't been dealt with fairly, or there's been unreasonable obstruction of justice and flow of information because of the positions that these departments have taken. There's got to be some consequences here. We have to induce good behavior, and we're not seeing that right now. So would an advocate general or would any of those measures help? And look, I voted for the FOIA bill that we've passed here, fully supported, but I don't think it addresses every single aspect of what you're bringing up here today. Mr. Fitton.
The concern is about these administrative agencies. They'll have opinions, and it's another layer of bureaucracy that may or may not be helpful, and the courts may give undue deference to them, and they are still working for the agency at issue. IGs are interesting creatures. Many IG reports are both exposés and cover-ups at the same time. And I think it's notable, I think it's in the new FOIA legislation that there's a mandate that material behind IG investigations be publicized as well, or made public, that it currently isn't happening. So getting access to the courts and taking away the deference, giving courts, taking away the excuse courts have to give deference to the agency discretion on these withholdings, that's what we have to work around, because as long as they have that discretion, it's going to be very difficult to overcome that, because the courts are going to say, who am I going to listen to? The agencies who know what they're doing? What do you know, Judicial Watch, about the damage to the agency's deliberative process if I don't release this information? Or they're weighing privacy interests. I mean, during the Bush administration, one of my favorite worst examples was that after 9/11, one of the agencies redacted the name of Osama bin Laden to protect his personal privacy. Now, we can laugh about it, but it took a lot of time for us to undo it.
Not to cut you off, and I appreciate the example, but the Inspector Generals are swimming in that world. They're constantly dealing with that world, so they too have a discretion and a certain balance of interest there, where they're trying to get information for us, and they work with this committee especially.
And they already have an obligation to enforce the law, and FOIA is already. In theory, there's nothing preventing them from doing FOIA investigations and the oversight as you suggest.
I guess I'm just trying to short-circuit this process that you're all going through very painfully. Thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lynch. The chair now recognizes Mr. Carter from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here. We appreciate, as if you had any other choice, being here, but we do appreciate it very much. Ms. Garcia, I'm interested particularly in your role with the Resource Center and in your dealings with DHS. I have a bill that is before DHS right now, H.R. 1615, dealing with FOIA. As you know, DHS has got the largest backlog of any other agency in the way of FOIA requests, and I'm very concerned about that, and that's what this bill addresses, is that backlog, to try to catch us up and try to help us to address it. But what I want to ask you about is particularly the fees that are involved in this. What do you find most problematic? Is it the high price of the fees, or the estimation of what the fees are going to be? What's the biggest problem when it comes to the fees for a FOIA request?
Well, one of the largest problems, Mr. Carter, thank you so much for your question. One of the largest problems is that the agencies know that most requesters don't know the law. So they actually make things up as they go along. A lot of contractors are working at DHS, and so what's being not shown in the full-time employee numbers that were given by Mr. Cummings, the ranking member, is that, in fact, there's this whole crew of shadow workers at DHS. They're there to kill the FOIAs, not to fulfill them. They will give you a phone call and tell you, just as was said in the earlier panel, that your FOIA doesn't make sense or that it doesn't somehow comply. All of that time is added to the fee that it took to process your request. On top of this, because the contract regulations don't allow contractors to make decisions, then you need a second layer where an actual employee rubber stamps the work of the other person. Now you've gotten a bill for double the price.
Right. Well, let me ask you, you gave us an example where you had requested a $60 fee waiver, and you got an 8-page response. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I read through this, and this looks like legal jargon to me. I can only imagine how much this cost to assimilate as opposed to just waiving the $60 fee.
That's exactly right, Mr. Carter. In point of fact, the request only amounted to $3. But after they added the contractor and the rubber stamper, then it actually resulted in a $60 fee, so it was something like a 1,900% increase. And then someone who gets paid roughly in the neighborhood of $225,000 a year took the time to write out, not including benefits and perquisites, took the time to write out an 8-page legal memo, like to the nines, like we were going to court. So yes, in fact, they add their own. 25% of these budgets are going to FOIA defense, and that was as much as I could adequately, honestly compute. It may be more. I would say that your bill trying to curb DHS expense in FOIA is very welcome, precisely the provision that talks about auditing, as long as we don't hire another contractor to perform the audit.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. How often, did they give you an estimate of how much it's going to be?
They do, and there is an interesting procedure that's starting to get widespread, like catching like wildfire all over the federal government, which is they do give you an estimate. They say, if you don't give us this money or promise to pay this money within 10 days, we will close your request. Of course, you can appeal this decision, no problem. You have 45, 60 days, whatever it is. The problem is, once they've already killed your request, what incentive does the agency have to reverse its original position and then suddenly grant you the fee waiver and revive your FOIA request? It doesn't happen.
Right, right. Okay, again, in dealing with the fees and when they're coming up with these estimates, one thing that bothers me is, obviously my bill deals with DHS, but we need a consistent policy throughout all the agencies. Is that something that you feel like, Ms. Mitchell, is that something that you think would be possible? Because it appears to me, from what I've heard today, not only with this panel, but the first panel as well, is that it's haphazard among the agencies.
It is completely haphazard, and it's interesting. But if you submit a FOIA request, the exact same FOIA request to multiple agencies, you will get radically different levels of response. And some agencies are more responsive than others, and the IRS just happens to be one that takes the position that they're not going to answer any FOIA requests unless you sue them. That's just their that's their default position. So there is no standard of responsiveness, level of responsiveness, how they price things, nothing.
Okay. Well, guys, hang in there. We're doing the best we can. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carter. The chair now recognizes Mr. Heiss from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here today. Very disturbing information. Just as a general rule, what would you say is the average time it takes to receive a FOIA response? Is there any average or any way of determining that?
If they could, it'd be years. To sue, it's
All right, so you're
6 to
saying
9
average would be years?
months. A lawsuit may get you documents in less than a year.
Okay, Ms. Mitchell.
I have so many clients who could paper a room with letters from Ms. Higley from the IRS. She generates those letters. She's a very nice person, and at least she'll generate these fake dates every 90 days. You get another letter. You get another letter.
Would you say years?
Years. This has been going on years.
Okay, Mr. Jones.
Varies agency by agency. The longest National Security Archive has is over 2 decades.
Mercy. Ms. Garcia.
Usually clients, before they come to me, it's 2 to 3 years in a lawsuit.
Okay, Mr. Rodman.
Part of the problem is there's two separate averages. So for cases where the documents are politicized, it's far more than the 20 days. And then for run-of-the-mill cases, it's less.
Okay, Ms. Weissman?
Months to years.
Okay. So far beyond the 20 days. I mean, in fact, it is an extreme situation that the law is actually followed. Mr. Fenton, let me go back to you. Do you believe that there is an attempt by agencies to obstruct? Is the word obstruction too strong?
No, it's not the case. It's not too strong, particularly with the IRS and the State Department. That's knowing and willful conduct that rises to a criminal level, in my view. The General Counsel of the IRS was there during the IRS attacks on the Tea Party, and he's there guiding the document response into that very scandal.
All right, so you absolutely use the word obstruction is taking place.
Criminal obstruction.
Criminal obstruction. All right, so would you go so far as to say that we are potentially facing a constitutional crisis if, just say FOIA requests are regularly denied? We've got some constitutional issues potentially in the making.
Well, not only do you have that vis-a-vis the executive branch and the citizenry, but you have it with the interbranch relations as well, so yes.
Okay. Ms. Fitton, let me go to you. You stated a moment ago that you were told by an agency official that if you scrutinize the government, that the government will scrutinize you, I believe.
Yeah, that was during,
that was
during a discussion about an IRS audit. It was an IRS official who told us that.
Okay, unbelievable. All right, so does that mean that the IRS considers a FOIA request government scrutiny?
Oh, for sure, for sure.
All right, so the IRS would look at a FOIA request as an attempt by an individual or a group to scrutinize the government, and therefore they are worthy of retaliation.
I believe there have been retaliatory audits for activities of groups that are opposed to either this administration or prior administrations, yes.
All right. Well, Ms. Fenton, let me go to you. I believe then you said that you personally got involved in this whole thing because of people you're now representing who were scrutinized by the government. All right. Specifically, or is that IRS, or are there other agencies?
It's both.
Both what?
Both. I have one client who actually testified before a subcommittee of this committee in the last Congress. And when she filed applications for exempt status for 2 Tea Party groups within a very short period of time, she was visited personally by the IRS. Her business was visited twice by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Her business was suddenly audited by OSHA. I included the FBI came 7 times. I mean, this is a woman who had been living her life for quite a long time with none of that government interest in her or her family.
So connecting the dots is undeniable, in your opinion?
Certainly seems more of a coincidence.
Okay. If it's not already been stated, could you provide that evidence to this committee? Or
Yes,
has that
happy
already
to
been submitted?
It has been in the last Congress. I'm more than happy to provide it again.
All right, thank you for that. Ms. Garcia, let me end my time with you. You stated just a moment ago that the DHS, I believe, you mentioned specifically, has the attitude that absolutely their attempt is to avoid fulfilling FOIA requests rather than meet those requests. Is that right?
Absolutely. In fact, the DHS FOIA chief said I was the Kerry Washington of FOIA, that if somebody needed a request, they knew where to get it handled. Who would say that? I mean, that's like a scandal. That's like a TV show.
Would you submit that evidence to this committee?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Heiss. The chair now recognizes myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Fenton, in regard to the memo from the White House that Mr. Jordan read, in which they directed every executive agency to notify them of any request for information. And in the context of your answer to a question Mr. Heiss just asked about, and which you responded is criminal obstruction, that's pretty strong. I want to know what you would think about an agency possibly engaging in an effort to instruct their employees on how to work with outside groups to avoid the requirements of a FOIA request?
Well, it certainly would be inappropriate. The Justice Department is the locus of evil when it comes to FOIA noncompliance. All the agencies get represented by the Justice Department, and everything they say and everything they do in terms of withholding is almost always supported by the Justice Department. I would bring the Attorney General or a representative up from Justice and say, tell us those cases that you've turned away.
Let me share with you some information that I shared with the panel earlier from the press. This is the written testimony submitted by Mr. David Schneier, former employee of the EPA, who testified that the EPA had prepared an 83-page PowerPoint presentation on how to use electronic tools to collaborate with external partners. And I'm not going to read all of this, but he talked about the use of instant messaging, other real-time correspondence tools, even encouraging using AOL and Yahoo and asking third parties to set up chat rooms. And then here's the part I find particularly troublesome. He said, this presentation also documents a culture of disregard for agency duties under public records and FOIA requirements. It characterizes FOIA and the NARA rules as federal laws that constrain federal administration of public-facing web collaboration tools. That's actually, here's the PowerPoint from that.
Yeah,
and listed among those, let me,
Yeah, go ahead,
is the NARA, the Federal Advisory Committee Act, the Paperwork Reduction Act. I mean, this, and then he goes on and says, the next section of the presentation describes creative solutions to dealing with federal constraints. Now, they've already considered these requests for documents to be constraints and openly suggest ways to circumvent public records acts. Specifically, EPA encourages its employees to help outside parties to sponsor the web-based collaboration tools, noting that as long as we're only participants, not administrators of a web collaboration site, the site is not limited by those same FOIA and Public Records Act constraints. How would you respond to that? How would you characterize that? Let me say that. Put it that way.
Well, that's willful. That's a willful avoidance of the law, and the criminal law already prevents. There's a criminal sanction for willful concealment of documents, and the classification issues with a process like that are significant. You could have classified records depending on the agency, and to be creating federal records and not maintaining them in a willful way is a criminal violation of law. And you know, this is a dramatic illustration of a coordinated effort to avoid transparency laws and disclosure.
So that would perhaps go beyond obstruction.
Well, when I say obstruction, when there is a willful concealment of records, you're violating the Freedom of Information Act, but there are criminal sanctions associated with concealing records, and that has got to be a tool that prosecutors, you know, they can do a case against the former Speaker of the House by interpreting the structuring laws, the anti-structuring laws. Maybe they can figure out how to do the criminal laws and impose them on the federal bureaucracy that willfully violate FOIA in ways that take away our freedom to know what our government's up to.
Would any of the other panel like to respond to that?
I'd add that it's very widespread.
I would also add that LinkedIn is something to be looked into. It's probably because the FOIAs are so slow that didn't make it to that. I mean, they talked about Yahoo Messenger or something ridiculous like that. But indeed, LinkedIn has sold $500,000 of contracts, and I went to a training for government officers, and they were specifically told to use their private email accounts to be able to communicate with people.
I would like to thank all of our witnesses for taking the time to appear today. If there is no further business without objection, the committee stands adjourned.